Have you ever wondered what it costs to build empires? Rome, a symbol of civilization, law, and order. But if you scratch away that marble facade, you'll see rot. Slaves in chains, women sold like merchandise, emperors bathing in blood and debauchery. This isn't a story of victories. This is a story of sins. Subscribe to our channel and give us a like. Today, you'll hear what most people prefer to keep quiet about. Welcome to the dark side of Rome. The world may admire Rome, but Rome itself was built on broken bodies and stolen lives. From the very beginning of the Roman Republic, and later the empire, slavery was one of its cornerstones. This wasn't an exception. It was the norm, so much so that Romans didn't even consider slaves to be people. Legally, a slave was considered property. They could be sold, traded, punished, or killed. And this wasn't considered a crime. When Rome began conquering new lands, especially in the 3rd to 1st centuries BC, waves of slaves started pouring into the city like an avalanche. After the victory over Carthage, for example, tens of thousands of people were enslaved. After every battle, after every conquered city, the living, humiliated, and shackled prisoners became new building blocks for the Roman economy. Slaves were captured all across the Mediterranean. Greeks, Gauls, Egyptians, Syrians, Jews, and Germans. They ended up in Rome as trophies, as tribute, as victims of the war machine. It didn't matter who you were before. A prince, a philosopher, a craftsman, or a mother of a family. In the eyes of Rome, you were nothing. Life in chains. A slave could be anyone and do anything depending on where they were assigned. Some were forced to work in the fields until exhaustion, until death. These people were often kept in chains, sometimes out in the open. They were barely fed, and no one cared about their health. They died, and new ones were brought in to take their place. Others were sent to the quarries. This was considered a death sentence. The average life expectancy of a slave in a Roman mine was less than a year. Hell began underground. Heat, dust, and nothing to breathe. Constant supervision with a whip in hand. House slaves were the privileged ones. They cleaned, cooked, took care of the children, and bared their bodies and souls before their masters. But even they weren't guaranteed safety. Everything depended on the master's mood. A single look, and a slave could be beaten, raped, sold, or executed in public. A slave as merchandise. Strict rules were enforced at the slave markets in Rome. Slaves were displayed like livestock. They had signs hung around their necks listing their age, skills, nationality, and physical defects. Sometimes a brand was burned onto their foreheads. Women were examined and groped, chosen either for the household or for the bedroom. There was especially high demand for the young, the attractive, and those who could read, write, cook, or speak several languages. Such slaves were sold at higher prices, like a premium class. Wealthy Romans could own up to several hundred slaves, from cooks to bodyguards, from teachers for their children to party organizers. But even talent didn't save them. A slave is not a person. They are a convenient, controllable, completely rightless mechanism. He had no family name, no honor, no future. Slavery as the foundation of the economy. The system of slavery in Rome was not just a side effect of conquest. It was an economic model. Without it, Rome would have collapsed. Slaves did the work, while free citizens rested, sat in the Senate, and enjoyed themselves at the arenas. Slaves built roads, aqueducts, and villas. Slaves were engaged in trade. Slaves carried everything on their shoulders, from grain to stone, from pleasures to taxes. They were even used in the army as servants, porters, and human shields. Anyone who resisted was subject to punishment. The laws protected only the masters. For example, if a slave struck his master, he could be crucified. If a master died and it wasn't clear who was to blame, all his slaves could be executed. Hundreds of innocent people could die for the sake of one Roman, who could become a slave. You could be born a slave if your mother was a slave. You could be sold by your parents during times of famine. You could be captured by an enemy, fall victim to pirates, be punished for debts, or be accused of a crime. Sometimes even a free person could end up at an auction by accident, kidnapped, framed, or forgotten by the system. The stories of children were especially tragic. They were bought specifically to be raised, and sometimes for perverse purposes. The law did not restrict the owner in how they treated underage slaves. It was the same abyss, only even deeper. The pain that went unheard, slavery did not raise any doubts among the Romans. It was seen as a natural and necessary part of the world. Philosophers, even the Stoics, rarely spoke about freeing slaves. They talked about the proper conduct of the master, and yet, in letters on tombstones, in discovered diaries, archaeologists read fragments of pain. Slaves scratched on the walls, "I am a human being." One wrote, "If someone is reading this, I am still alive." They suffered in silence because their voices were not needed. Their fate was predetermined. Rome was not built by slaves. It was built on slaves. When you are stripped of everything, even your own name, only one weapon remains: despair. Rome was confident in its power. It built everything on fear, but even the strongest chain can one day break. And when that happened, blood flowed like a river. The history of Rome knew many small slave uprisings. But one name still echoes through the centuries: Spartacus. Spartacus is a symbol of rebellion. He was a Thracian, possibly a former soldier. He was captured and ended up in a gladiator school in Capua. It seemed his fate was sealed. The arena, blood, a slow death. But in 73 BC, Spartacus and 70 other gladiators staged an escape. They grabbed kitchen knives and overpowered the guards. In just a few weeks, the army of slaves grew to 70,000 people. They were runaway slaves, peasants, women, children, everyone who wanted to be free. They were welcomed as heroes. They defeated legions. They burned with hope. Rome was in a panic, a war they wanted to forget. The Roman elite didn't immediately realize how serious the uprising had become. Armies were sent one after another, and one after another they were defeated. Spartacus wasn't just strong, he was smart. He led his people toward the Alps, hoping to leave Italy. But part of the army wanted revenge, looting, and blood. Was that a mistake? Maybe. In 71 BC, the general Crassus caught up with the rebels and destroyed them. The battlefield was covered with bodies. As for Spartacus himself, some sources say he died in battle, while others claim his body was never found. But Rome did not forgive even the dead. 6,000 slaves who were taken prisoner were crucified along the Appian Way, from Capua to Rome, nearly 200 kilometers. Crucifixion after crucifixion. No mercy, no hope. This was a lesson for anyone who wanted to follow in Spartacus's footsteps. The Roman punishment machine was not just cruel, it was systematic. For every act, a slave faced punishment. If a slave ran away, hunters would catch him, brand his forehead, and might even cut his tendons. If you stole, they cut off your hand. If you spoke out, they cut out your tongue. There were laws in the empire, but slaves were outside the law. One of the most terrifying punishments was crucifixion. It was used on a massive scale, sometimes even just for rumors of an uprising. The Romans didn't just kill. They made it clear that any disobedience meant a slow, public, and agonizing death. Rumors about untas. Despite all the horrors, the slaves didn't give up. They whispered to each other at night, passed along secrets and signs, sometimes tried to poison their masters, and sometimes set fire to warehouses. But all of this was harshly suppressed. Fear was a constant presence in Roman households. Masters would lock themselves in at night. They only trusted those who had served them for decades. Even the wealthiest citizens could wake up to a slave's knife. A network of surveillance was built around the slaves. Some slaves watched over others. Fear seeped into every room, into every glance. Emotions that had no place there. Were there any happy slaves? There were. There were those who were freed, who got a chance to become a freedman. They could work, earn money, even obtain Roman citizenship. But such cases were rare. For the majority, life remained a chain. Many Romans believed that slaves had no feelings, no pain, no attachments. But tombstones tell a different story. One Roman, in a fit of anger, killed a slave, and years later his wife put up a plaque with the words, "He was kinder than many free men." These were tiny sparks of humanity in an ocean of horror. Why did everyone put up with this? Many people wonder why slaves didn't revolt more often. Why didn't tens of millions overthrow their Roman masters? The answer is simple: fear. The system was designed to leave no choice. Punishments were brutal. Informants were everywhere. There was almost no hope. And most importantly, the Romans were masters of manipulation. They rewarded some slaves, punished others, and created internal competition. The slaves weren't fighting for power. They were simply fighting to wake up alive the next day. The Roman paradox, the paradox of Rome, is that it built ideals of freedom on the backs of slaves. He talked about justice and sold people. He created philosophy while depriving millions of a voice. Even the most enlightened minds, Cicero, Seneca, rarely questioned the very institution of slavery. They might have been kind masters, but they were not fighters for freedom, because in Rome, freedom was a privilege, not a right. The legacy of slavery. When Rome fell, slavery did not disappear. It flowed into feudalism, into the colonies, into modern times. We still feel its traces in culture, in language, in our way of thinking. The world remembers the names of emperors, but not the names of slaves. They built the roads we still walk on, the houses that are now museums, and even the ideas that became the foundation of European thought. They are the forgotten builders of civilization. When power becomes absolute, pleasure turns into a weapon. The Roman Empire became famous not only for its legions and laws, but also for its obsessive cult of the body, pleasures, and carnal power. Sex in Rome was not just a part of everyday life. It was part of the system, a tool of control, a means of manipulation, a symbol of status, and often a way to humiliate. Sex was the currency of the Roman elite. The upper echelons of Roman society could afford anything. Emperors, senators, the wealthy, they wielded control over bodies as easily as they did over land or slaves. In Rome, sex was a currency of power. The more lovers, concubines, and slave girls you had, the louder and more depraved your feasts and orgies, the cooler, higher, and more influential you were. For many senators, Publicly flaunting their sexual conquests was a way to show strength, humiliate a rival by sleeping with his wife, or by loyalty through seduction. Even in court cases, accusations could come up not about corruption, but about being too passive in bed. And that was considered humiliating. In Rome, being seduced meant losing face, especially if you were a man. Sex was a theater of dominance. Brothels, public orgies, and houses of tolerance in Rome were legal, public, and everywhere. According to archaeologists, there were more than 30 brothels in Pompeii alone. You can easily recognize them by the drawings on the walls, frescoes with explicit scenes. This was not hidden. It was the norm. Price lists were often posted at the entrance, what service you could get for what price. The prostitutes were mostly slaves. They didn't get to choose their fate. They were put on display like merchandise, and many of them were just 12 to 14 years old. Wealthy Romans would throw parties where guests were entertained by dancers, singers, boy slaves, and special performers. Sometimes what happened would turn into a group event where classes, bodies, and alcohol all mixed together. Imperial perversions. If ordinary Romans threw feasts, the emperors orchestrated orgies like directors. The stories about Caligula, Nero, Commodus, and Elagabalus aren't just rumors. They're repeated by different historians. Of course, some of it might be exaggerated, but the fact is that debauchery was the norm among the upper echelons. Caligula held banquets where senators' wives served the guests right at the table. Nero married a eunuch, dressing him in a wedding gown. Commodus organized gladiator fights and afterwards, intimate scenes with the losers. Elagabalus, according to rumors, created rooms where there were no genders at all, only sensations. Sex became entertainment, a ritual, and sometimes even a form of torture for them. Women as objects and weapons. A woman in Rome was always under control, from her father to her husband, from her husband to society. Her body did not belong to her. It was part of a deal, a dowry, a political alliance. Many girls were married off at 12 or 13 years old. Divorce was possible, but it was mostly men who could initiate it. And yet, Roman women were not just victims. Some, especially those from the upper classes, played by these harsh rules themselves. Livia, the wife of Augustus, ruled the empire from the bedroom. Messalina, the wife of Claudius, was rumored to compete with prostitutes in the number of partners she had in a single night. Cleopatra, although Egyptian, became a symbol of erotic diplomacy. In Rome, sex could be used to sell, to humiliate, to take revenge, but also to rule. Debauchery as a habit, Romans didn't see a problem with it. For them, debauchery wasn't a sin. It was a natural part of life. Even the upbringing of teenagers included erotic conversations. Satirists like Martial or Juvenal openly wrote poems about sodomy, adultery, orgies, and these were read aloud in the forums. The idea of chastity in Rome was for philosophers or provincial wives. Real life was about feasts, wine, the body, and fleeting pleasure. But behind this outward merriment, there was fear. Everyone knew that one mistake, and you'd be exposed. One rumor, and your reputation would be dragged through the mud, especially if you were a woman or a slave. The body, as a symbol of power over another, was an everyday reality in Rome. In the baths, in the public baths, in the arenas, a beautiful body was a sign of status. Fat men were mocked, and women were judged by their childbearing features. Even slaves were chosen for their looks. Everything was about the body, but not about love. Love in Rome was considered a weakness. It was the domain of poets suffering alone. A true Roman was supposed to dominate, and sexuality was just an extension of that. It was a cult of the ego. Not passion, but power. They were commodities, they were symbols, they were weapons, but sometimes they became players. A woman in Rome was born with a stigma, not a person, but a function. A daughter for marriage, a wife for an heir, a mistress for pleasure, a slave for all of it at once. However, even in this harsh world, there were women who turned their own bodies into instruments of influence. Their story isn't about romance, it's about survival. Slaves for the bed. Sexual slavery in Rome was so commonplace that it wasn't even discussed. Any self-respecting citizen had several slave women for personal use, sometimes boys, often children. There was simply no law that protected a female slave from sexual violence. The master could share his bed with several concubines. This was considered normal. They were called concubines, mistresses. They didn't have the status of a wife, couldn't inherit property, but were often closer to the master than his legal spouse. If a slave woman gave birth to the master's child, the child became a slave. But if the master acknowledged the child, he could grant them freedom, give them his name, and even make them an heir. So a woman's body became a channel for social mobility, sometimes the only one. Prostitutes and actresses. In Rome, a woman who was an actress was automatically considered a prostitute. These weren't different professions, they were synonyms. Women who performed on stage entertained not only with their voices, but also with their bodies. They were invited to banquets, sold, used, mocked, and admired. Some of them became public favorites, had affairs with senators, and influenced politics. But the price was high. One mistake and everything would collapse. In Roman society, you could be a star, but you had no right to respect. The story of Clotilde, an actress who became the lover of 3 consuls, was famous. She had access to secrets, knew their weaknesses, whispered in the right ears, but one day she was accused of conspiracy. She was drowned without a trial. Not one of her former lovers stood up for her, women of the upper class. In a patrician's house, a woman appeared to be respected, but it was just a facade. In reality, her fate was determined by a man. She couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, and couldn't manage property without her husband's consent. But there are exceptions in history. Roman matrons were not always quiet shadows. Some of them became rulers behind the scenes. Livia Drusilla, the wife of Augustus, controlled the court, eliminated rivals, and influenced appointments. It was said that she was the one who poisoned the heirs so that her son Tiberius would become emperor. Agrippina the Younger, the mother of Nero, went down in history as one of the most ambitious and dangerous women in Rome. She seduced Emperor Claudius, married him, and then, according to historians, poisoned him to secure the throne for her son. But Nero repaid her in kind. He ordered her to be killed. Sex as diplomacy. The influence of women was not limited to the bedrooms of emperors. Sometimes, bodies became instruments of international politics. A vivid example is Cleopatra. Yes, she wasn't Roman, but her affair with Julius Caesar, and later with Mark Antony, became part of the Great Game. Cleopatra didn't just make men fall in love with her, she controlled them. She used her beauty, intelligence, culture, and her bed to influence the course of history. The Romans both hated and admired her. After her death, Octavian launched a smear campaign against her. He claimed she was an Eastern harlot who corrupted Rome's greatest men. But no one could deny that she played as an equal. Empresses were not wives, but instruments. The imperial family was a showcase. The emperor's wife had to be flawless. But behind the scenes, there were intrigues, jealousy, and infidelity. Empresses often played dangerous roles. Messalina, the wife of Claudius, went down in history as a symbol of unrestrained lust. Rumor had it that she held competitions with prostitutes and changed lovers like gloves. But one day she crossed the line. She married another man while the emperor was still alive. She was executed without trial. Faustina, the wife of Marcus Aurelius, had affairs with gladiators. The emperor knew and kept silent because in Rome, a woman's body was managed according to the situation. The fear of being a woman. Women in Rome lived under double pressure. On one hand, there was the patriarchy where every step you took was controlled. On the other hand, there was the expectation to be beautiful, desirable, but still respectable. A single mistake could cost you your life, even if you posed no threat to anyone. Slave women feared being sold. Wives feared being accused of adultery. Actresses feared being drowned. And empresses feared being poisoned. And yet they lived, manipulated, loved, and fought, even if it was in silence. Who was a woman in Rome? The answer is harsh, an instrument, but also a spark. Could be burned, but sometimes it burned everything around it. It was in Rome that the duality was born, the one that would haunt women for centuries. To be an object and at the same time to be a force. When a person gains absolute power, he ceases to be human. Rome was great because it created a system, but Rome fell because it gave too much to one person. The emperor's power eventually became limitless. Neither the Senate, nor the people, nor the army could restrain the one who wore the crown. And when such people lost their minds, all of Rome lost its mind as well. Some rulers became legends, but not because of their victories, because of their madness. Caligula, a god among mortals, Caligula is one of the most infamous emperors. His name became synonymous with tyranny and madness. At the beginning of his reign, everyone hoped that the young ruler would restore order. But it soon became clear, a monster sat on the throne. He deified himself, ordered temples to be built in his honor, forced senators to worship him as a god, wore women's clothing, and spoke on behalf of Jupiter. Sometimes he would suddenly interrupt a meeting just to shout, "I can kill any one of you right now." He threw banquets where he would hand over senators' wives to the guests. Then, the next day, he would discuss the details in the Senate in a humiliating manner. He appointed his horse Incitatus as a priest and, according to rumors, was planning to make him a consul. Death out of boredom. It is said that Caligula destroyed people simply because he was bored. He could order the execution of someone whose face seemed too serious to him, or command the guards to throw Romans off a bridge just for the spectacle. Once, when there were no executions, he sighed, "What a day! No one died." He enjoyed the fear. And it wasn't anger, it was a game. Nero, an artist in blood, Nero went down in history as one of the most self-absorbed and destructive emperors. He was obsessed with the stage. He dreamed of being a singer, an actor, a poet. And he forced aristocrats to listen to his performances for hours. Those who didn't applaud enthusiastically enough would disappear. He poisoned his own brother and killed his pregnant wife Poppaea by kicking her in the stomach. Then he found a slave who resembled her, had him castrated, and married him. His mother, Agrippina, at first helped him rise to power, but later became an obstacle. Nero tried to drown her on a specially designed boat, but she survived. so he simply ordered her to be stabbed to death. The burning of Rome? The most famous accusation against Nero is the burning of Rome. In the year 64, the city caught fire, and the blaze raged for 6 days. Rumors spread that the emperor himself had done it to build a new palace for himself. Supposedly, he watched the burning city from a tower and played the lyre, enjoying the view. Nero blamed the Christians, a new, little understood sect. They were seized, burned, crucified, and forced to fight wild animals. In the eyes of the people, he was a savior, but in the eyes of history, the first cruel dictator showman. Commodus, a gladiator on the throne, the son of the philosopher Marcus Aurelius, Commodus was the complete opposite of his father. While Marcus was known for his wisdom, Commodus was infamous for his debauchery, cruelty, and love of spectacle. He loved the arena. He performed as a gladiator himself. For money. Against slaves who had been deliberately weakened beforehand. He considered himself a new Hercules, depicted himself as such in statues, and wore a lion's skin and carried a club. Commodus renamed Rome as the colony of Commodus, named the months after himself, desecrated temples, mocked philosophers, and staged executions for entertainment. People feared him, but they didn't respect him. In the end, he was strangled by his own wrestling coach. Hadrian, Elagabalus, and some other emperors were less bloodthirsty, but no less strange. Elagabalus, a young emperor with Eastern roots, threw feasts where the dishes were made of gold and the guests were naked. He declared the sun to be the main god of Rome and himself its priest. He introduced strange laws, mixed religions, and held sexual orgies involving senators. In the end, he was stabbed to death by his own guard. Hadrian, on the other hand, was more balanced, but he had his own obsession with the young Antinous, whom he nearly deified after his death. Historians still debate whether this was love, a cult, or political manipulation. Madness as a disease of power. What united these rulers? It wasn't just cruelty, but the fact that no one could stop them. Absolute power in Rome was like a drug. It gave a sense of divinity and at the same time destroyed a person from within. When the lives of thousands are at your mercy, you lose touch with reality. When everyone around you is either a slave, a flatterer, or an enemy, you either snap or go insane. Emperors didn't just become madmen. Rome created monsters and worshipped them. The throne of Rome stood on blood, but blood was spilled not only on the battlefield, it ran down the marble columns of the palace. When power becomes absolute, the ruler's personal fears turn into state policy. Emperors obsessed with paranoia, control, and their own importance created an atmosphere where no one felt safe. The court turned not into a center of governance, but into an arena where survival was the game. The palace was a trap. Life at the Imperial court seemed dazzling on the surface. Feasts, marble, poets, statues, music. But inside, it was a cage where any word, gesture, or even a glance could cost you your life. People smiled while waiting to be summoned for interrogation. The emperor often knew everything, or at least thought he did. He was surrounded by a network of informants, slaves, servants, advisors, priests. No one knew who would betray them or who already had. A rumor, whispered under someone's breath, would turn into an accusation, and within an hour the person would disappear. No trial, no explanation. Senators are victims under the spotlight. In theory, the Senate was a stronghold of power and wisdom. But with the rise of mad emperors, senators became targets, especially if they were wealthy, popular, or, God forbid, good-looking. The emperor could invite a senator to a feast, get him drunk, humiliate him, and then the next morning accuse him of conspiracy. His property would be confiscated, his family exiled or killed, and his body thrown into the Tiber. Some emperors amused themselves by forcing senators to attend humiliating performances or even take part in them, singing, dancing, or praising the ruler in verse. Refusal meant death. Applause that wasn't enthusiastic enough meant death, and applause that was too enthusiastic aroused suspicion. Then, Daria. In the psychology of paranoia, Roman emperors often became prisoners of their own fear. They saw a conspiracy in every person, a threat in every tone of voice. Some of them suffered from obvious mental disorders, but instead of getting help, they received power. After killing his mother, Nero began to see her ghost. He would wake up in a sweat, scream at night, and perform exorcism rituals. Every night, Caligula ordered the guards to check all the columns in the palace, searching for spies. Commodus conducted inspections among the guards, changed his security detail daily, and forbade anyone from coming closer than 10 steps without permission. It wasn't just power over others. It was a constant war with oneself. Executions as a spectacle. An execution in Rome was not just about elimination. It was a demonstration. The emperor turned killing into theater. Arenas, squares, and forums became stages where power showed what it was capable of. Some victims were thrown to wild beasts, others were burned alive, and still others were forced to commit suicide. This was even considered an honorable alternative to execution. They would bring you a knife, a cup of poison, or a sword. You could choose how you would die. If you refused, they would do it for you, but slowly and as a spectacle. The families of those executed were often forced to watch. Sometimes children were forced to witness the deaths of their fathers. This was a tool of intimidation. The emperor didn't just rule over people's bodies, he ruled through fear. Fear among his own. But the danger didn't come only from the emperor. People at court lived in a state of total distrust. One denunciation, and you're saved. One refusal to inform, and you're dead. Brothers informed on brothers, wives on husbands, teachers on students. Some tried to save themselves by staying silent, others by bribery, but no one felt safe. The historian Suetonius wrote that in the last years of Caligula's reign, Romans walked the city with their eyes downcast, afraid to look each other in the face. Even wine was poured slowly, so as not to seem too cheerful. The emperor was like both a god and a demon. The more fear there was, the stronger the cult of personality became. Emperors were depicted not as people, but as gods. Their statues stood everywhere. Their faces were stamped on coins. Their names included in prayers. Even if the ruler was a sadist and a madman, people bowed to him because the alternative was death. Caligula ordered the heads of the god statues to be removed and replaced with his own. Elagabalus built temples to himself and ordered sacrifices to be made, including human ones. Nero wrote poems about himself and forced senators to memorize them by heart. This was not just tyranny, it was a religion built on fear. Madness is contagious. The scariest thing is that over time, all of Rome began to live by these rules. The madness that started at the top of power seeped down, into the cities, into the homes, into people's hearts. People got used to executions, got used to suffering, got used to staying silent. When fear lasts too long, it becomes a culture. In Rome, you could die not from an enemy's sword, but from a friend's cup. Roman politics wasn't about debates. It was a chess game with poisoned pieces. Here, you didn't win with words. You won with poison, with the blade, and with lies. Poisonings, secret plots, sudden deaths. All of this wasn't the exception, but a tool. And the higher you climbed the ladder of power, the more often you had to look over your shoulder. Conspiracy as a style of governance. The Roman political system had one fundamental problem. There was only one emperor, but dozens who wanted his place. Every general, every senator, every close associate could potentially become the next ruler or the next victim. This created an atmosphere of total distrust. Enemies didn't act openly. They whispered at night, sent secret notes, hired mercenaries, and bribed cooks. Sometimes everything was decided in a single moment, a drop in a cup, the tip of a dagger, a forged letter. The closer you were to the emperor, the more dangerous it was. Poison is a weapon without noise. Poisoning was an especially popular way to eliminate an enemy. Why? Simple, quiet, effective. In Rome, they knew dozens of poison recipes based on plants, minerals, and animal toxins. Some killed instantly, others acted slowly, imitating illness so that no one would suspect murder. Poisonings often happened at banquets. Wine glasses, sauces, desserts, anything could be used. Most often, the victims were men who suddenly developed a cough, fever, or internal bleeding. The Roman elite even had entire schools dedicated to teaching the art of slow poisoning. Even the emperors themselves sometimes tested poisons on slaves to make sure of the dosage. Female poisoners. It wasn't just men who got involved in conspiracies. Women, deprived of direct access to power, found their own ways to exert influence. Many of them did so through poison. Livia, the wife of Emperor Augustus, was rumored to have poisoned her husband's heirs to clear the way for her own son, Tiberius. She would mix poison into food, ointments, and potions, all under the guise of treatment. In the 1st century BC, there was a group of women in Rome who would later be called the Poisoners' Club. They sold poisons, arranged deaths for hire, and even had secret codes and hidden recipes. When they were exposed, the scandal shook Rome, but it surprised no one. Forged letters and false denunciations. Sometimes you didn't even need to kill your enemy. It was enough to plant a letter, forge a signature, or hint to the emperor that someone had said something inappropriate. In Rome, the art of denunciation was perfected to an art form. People hired scribes who could imitate someone else's handwriting, forged wills to disinherit others, or created letters supposedly revealing conspiracies. The emperor, paranoid and obsessed with control, was quick to believe. That's how dozens of senators, military leaders, and their families were destroyed. All without any evidence. Just suspicions, just words. Traitors and hired killers. In Rome, you could buy someone's death. Hired assassins, known as sicarii, were part of the underground culture. They used short daggers, often hidden in their clothing. They killed quickly in crowds, at forums, in bathhouses, on the streets. They were paid in gold or with promises. Sometimes they were used for personal vendettas, other times as a tool of politics. You could even hire a slave to plunge the dagger in and then simply disappear. But the most reliable person was considered to be someone close to the victim, a servant, a guard, or a relative. Suicide under pressure. Voluntary suicide was common in Rome. A person was given a choice: end their own life or await execution. Many chose the former so that their family could keep their property. Sometimes this was carried out with theatrical cruelty. Julius Caesar, before his assassination in the Senate, received threatening letters but didn't believe them. On the day of his death, he ignored omens, advice, and even his wife. He was stabbed right in the meeting hall. 23 stab wounds. From his own people, from friends, from those who just yesterday kissed his hand. That was Rome. A bloody circle. The darkest thing about the Roman system was that the killers became victims. Today you eliminate your enemy and gain power. Tomorrow someone does the same to you. It was a vicious cycle. Caligula was killed by officers of his own guard. Nero fled and ended his own. Commodus was strangled by his own trainer. Domitian Vama stabbed his own slave to death. No one died peacefully. Almost every Roman emperor died a violent death. Even if he lived a long life, he was always in fear. Politics soaked in blood. For us, politics is about words, ideas, negotiations. For Rome, it was a theater of violence. Power was not handed over. It was seized through conspiracy, poison, and daggers. The history of Rome is not a history of laws, but a history of suspicion. In Rome, the most dangerous thing was to be born into a noble family. An empire that turned family lineage into a cult was, in reality, built on betraying one's own kin. It was often your own family in Rome that became your first enemy. Mothers killed sons, wives killed husbands, brothers killed each other. All for the throne, for power, for a name. Mothers who were murderers. The most striking figure was Agrippina the Younger. She was called the Black Widow of Rome, daughter of Germanicus, sister of Caligula, wife of Emperor Claudius, mother of Nero. She grew up surrounded by power and learned to wield it with coldness and ruthlessness. To secure power for her son, she allegedly poisoned her own husband, Emperor Claudius. According to legend, the poison was served in mushrooms, which he especially loved. After his death, Nero became emperor. But Agrippina went too far. She interfered in state affairs, told her son whom to sleep with, whom to execute. At first, Nero distanced himself, then tried to drown his mother on a ship with a sabotaged mechanism. She survived. Then he sent assassins. They stabbed her to death in her bedroom. Her last words were, "Strike my womb. That's where I carried the murderer." Wives as enemies under the covers. In Rome, a wife could be not only a victim, but also a predator, especially when it came to power. Many empresses eliminated rivals, lovers, even their own husbands. Through poison, through rumors, through seduction. Messalina, the wife of Claudius, was known not only for her promiscuity, but also for being a political threat. While the emperor was away, she entered into a sham marriage with another man, Gaius Silius. It was said that she was plotting a coup. When Claudius found out, he ordered her to be killed. At the last moment, she tried to escape, but was caught. The soldiers hesitated for a long time to strike. She took the dagger herself, but her hands were shaking. Then she was run through with a sword. Brothers and fathers became victims of ambition. There were no untouchables in Rome. Even blood ties didn't guarantee safety, especially in families where several sons competed for power. Caracalla, the son of Emperor Septimius Severus, killed his brother Geta to rule alone, and did it in a room where their mother was present. Later, he claimed that his brother was plotting a conspiracy himself. No one believed him, but everyone stayed silent. Constantine the Great, the Christian emperor who was later canonized, executed his own son Crispus and his wife Fausta. According to one version, it was out of jealousy. According to another, it was because of slander. Only after their deaths did it become clear that it was all a lie. The home was a battlefield. In a Roman household, every move was part of the game. Slaves whispered and reported. Children listened to parents. And later they betrayed. Wives slipped potions into food. Husbands punished their mistresses for getting too close to the enemy. Even a simple smile could be hiding a scheme. Emperor Domitian ordered his niece Julia to have an abortion because he was afraid the child would become a new contender for the throne. Later, Julia died, according to one version, from bleeding, according to another, from poisoning. Poison was a family affair. Many noble families kept poison recipes as family secrets. Mixtures based on belladonna, aconite, and arsenic were passed down from mother to daughter. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a legacy. Even cooking could serve as a cover. The cook in a Roman household wasn't just a servant. He could be the key to a murder. He could be bribed, intimidated, or blackmailed. Many cooks vanished without a trace after their master's death. They knew too much. An antidote to fear. Interesting fact, Roman emperors often took antidotes, even when no one was trying to poison them. These were special tinctures that had to be taken every day. They believed this would protect them from treachery. Mithridates VI, king of Pontus and an enemy of Rome, was so afraid of poison that he drank microdoses of the most dangerous substances to build up immunity. This became known in history as Mithridatism. Later, Roman aristocrats practiced this as well, but even that didn't save them. Poisons kept evolving, and the fear never went away. Love and death. The most tragic thing about this story is that in Rome, not even love could save you. Women who truly loved often suffered more than anyone else. They were wives, mothers, sisters, and still ended up under the blade. Because in Roman politics, feelings meant nothing, only power, only control, only survival. An empire of suspicion. In the end, Rome became a victim of its own system. An empire built on laws stopped believing in justice. An empire built on families was destroying itself from within. Every generation produced new poisoners, new conspirators, new traitors, because in a world without trust, there is no future. It's hard to rule with a sword. It's impossible to rule over a hungry people. But if they're well-fed and entertained, they'll forgive you for anything. Great Rome was held together not just by its army and slaves. It survived on the art of distraction, giving people the illusion of participation, keeping them fed so they wouldn't complain, and scaring them so they wouldn't ask questions. It wasn't just an empire of legions, it was an empire of propaganda. The formula, bread and circuses. The phrase bread and circuses went down in history as a formula for manipulating the people. It's not just a catchy slogan, it's a state strategy. When the people of Rome are hungry, they're dangerous. When they're well-fed and captivated by games, gladiator fights, or chariot races, they're harmless. The emperors figured this out quickly. Bread and circuses became tools of control. Every week, free rations were handed out: grain, wine, oil. And every week, there were grand shows in the arenas. At first glance, handing out bread under the watchful eye seems like humanism. In reality, it was about control. The food distribution was public, with officials present. Armed soldiers kept order. Anyone who argued, complained, or demanded more disappeared. Bread became a symbol of the emperor's mercy. He fed, he cared, so there was no need to ask questions. Why did the neighbor disappear? Or where did the taxes go? Or why another senator was killed? The well-fed people didn't care. They just chewed and stayed silent. The circus as a state machine, the main tool of distraction. The Circus Maximus was an arena that could hold up to 150,000 spectators. Here they held chariot races, athletic competitions, and theatrical performances. And just a bit further, the Colosseum, the heart of the spectacle. Here, death was turned into a show. Every morning, there was a fight to the death. Gladiators battled to the roar of the crowd. Beasts tore criminals apart, and prisoners were thrown into the arena unarmed just for laughs. Sometimes they would release hundreds of animals at once: tigers, bears, rhinoceroses. Sometimes they even staged naval battles. They would flood the arena with water and launch ships, all so that people would be amazed, frightened, and forget. Propaganda through blood. The emperor often attended the games himself. Sometimes he greeted the crowd, sometimes he gave the thumbs down. The crowd erupted. He seemed like a god. Posters hung on the walls of Rome: "Today, 100 lions." Or performance by the crowd favorite gladiator Spartacus. Yes, the name became legendary, even though the real Spartacus died 100 years before the Colosseum. The goal was to create the feeling that the empire was not a despotism, but a celebration. You're not a slave, you're a spectator. You're not suffering, you're applauding. The enemy has to be in the frame. To unite the people, you need an external enemy. In Rome, these were the barbarians, traitors, turncoats, and Christians. They were put in the arena, mocked in theaters, and blamed for all the troubles. Even when there was a shortage of food, they found guilty merchants, saboteurs, and bribed senators. They were given public executions. The people saw the guilty were punished. That meant the authorities were doing their job. This was crowd psychology. Instead of truth and image. Instead of reforms, shouting. Instead of freedom, spectacle. Silence as a means of survival. The average Roman had no idea what was happening in the Senate. He wasn't interested in political games. He didn't read philosophers. He knew that every week he would get his ration, and on Sunday there would be a fight in the arena. This was the foundation of stability. The empire understood. It's better to control hunger than thought. That's exactly why books were burned and intelligent people were exiled. Thinkers were turned into jesters. Those who went against the system disappeared, while those who stayed silent ate and watched. The emperor's role was both actor and director. Every emperor knew his main performance wasn't in the Senate, but in front of the crowd. He would step out onto the balcony, toss coins, make promises, and with gestures decide people's fates. Sometimes he would simply remain silent. The people would fill in the blanks for him. Some emperors were talented performers. Nero put on musical shows. Titus personally handed out food. Commodus entered the arena as a gladiator. It's all a show. And everyone either believed it or pretended to believe. When everything was falling apart, and sometimes there was neither bread nor entertainment, the harvest burned, the army suffered defeats, the emperor was ill, then fear and hunger returned, and the people remembered that they were a crowd, that they could shout not only with joy, but also with rage. That's how uprisings began. But almost always they were quickly crushed because Rome was prepared. Because the empire knew the show must go on. Always. When death becomes entertainment, humanity is the first thing to die in the spectators. The Colosseum is a symbol of Rome, a great architectural achievement, but it was also the greatest machine of psychological control in human history. Here, blood was not a tragedy, it was a show. Here, pain turned into applause, and the people became an obedient crowd. Architecture of terror. The Colosseum could hold more than 50,000 people. It was designed as the perfect trap for emotions. The stands were divided by class. The emperor was the center of attention. Loudspeakers, drums, gates from which beasts and fighters would burst out. Everything was calculated down to the smallest detail. You didn't just watch the fight. You could smell the blood, see the gladiator's lips trembling before death, hear the beast growling right at the edge of the arena, notice someone in the crowd placing a bet on the winner. It was total immersion, and it worked better than any law. Who was in the arena? Gladiators weren't just criminals and slaves. Sometimes they were volunteers, people seeking glory, or those who had nothing left to lose. But more often, they were the condemned, those whom the empire didn't even consider human. They were trained in special schools. They were taught to die beautifully with dignity, because in Rome, even death had to be spectacular. Wild animals were often released into the arena. Bears, tigers, lions, sometimes weakened so the audience could enjoy watching a person tear a predator apart. Other times, it was the opposite. The animal would tear the prisoner to pieces. No weapons, no chance. The role of the crowd. The crowd had the power to raise a finger, and the gladiator would be spared. If they lowered it, he would die. Or the opposite, depending on the era. But the main thing was that the people felt involved, powerful, able to decide someone's fate. It gave them a sense of control they didn't have in real life. The crowd shouted, threw flowers and sometimes stones. The crowd could elevate a fighter to stardom or forget about him in a minute. Everything depended on the show. The empire knew, if a person feels like a participant in the spectacle, he won't become an actor in a revolution. Executions as a spectacle. Executions were a separate category. In the morning, before the fights, it was like a warm-up. Condemned criminals were tied up, placed in the center of the arena, and then either released to the beasts or forced to fight each other to the death. Sometimes executions turned into theatrical performances. For example, they would reenact the myth of Prometheus, and instead of an eagle, they would release a real bird that pecked out a person's liver. Sometimes they crucified people on crosses, sometimes they set them on fire. All of this happened to the cheers of the crowd. It wasn't just cruelty, it became a habit, a mass habituation to pain as the norm, the gladiator as the star. Some fighters became legends. Their names were known on the streets. Their frescoes were painted on walls. Women sent them letters. The wealthy paid for their performances. Their clothing was sold as relics. But behind this glamour was the reality. Every morning you might not wake up. Every fight could be your last. Even the most famous gladiators ended the same way. Their bodies were carried out, the sand was watered down, and the crowd applauded. The spectacles in the Colosseum shaped a special type of citizen. He was emotional but obedient. He sought thrills but didn't ask unnecessary questions. He got used to pain as a part of life. Children grew up watching people being cut down in the arena. Teenagers screamed for blood. The elderly told stories about how people died. It was a culture of death wrapped in entertainment. Such a society is easy to control. It fears boredom more than tyranny. Propaganda through spectacle. The emperors used the Colosseum as their personal screen. During riots, more games. After military failures, free fights. On the ruler's birthday, mass amnesty and spectacles. Any discontent was extinguished with entertainment. No taxes, wars, or repressions could spark a revolt if 300 pairs of gladiators were set to fight in the arena the following week. That was the balance. Pain on stage, calm in the streets, decline through indifference. But over time, the audience started to get bored. The fights became repetitive. Deaths no longer moved anyone. The crowd demanded more and more, stronger, harsher. Sometimes even the emperors themselves would step into the arena just to win back interest. But when the empire weakened, the spectacles didn't help. You can't hide hunger with a lion, and games can't replace bread. Then the people turned their backs. The Colosseum emptied. The stage where thousands died became overgrown with grass, and all that remained were stones and the memory of how easily humanity forgets itself when it's being entertained. Empires don't die from blows. They die from exhaustion, from cynicism, from indifference. The Roman Empire, which once built cities, conquered continents, and set trends for the whole world, began to fall apart not because of the blows from the barbarians, but under the weight of its own vices. The great machine, powered by blood, fear, and gold, was cracking from within. It wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow, almost imperceptible decay. And at some point, everyone just got used to the smell. The exhaustion from a string of mad emperors, palace coups, and bloody intrigues led to the main thing. Society grew tired. No one believed anymore that power was a form of service. Senators became puppets, generals, potential usurpers, and emperors, temporary figures. Everyone ruled just to have time to steal, to erect a statue of themselves, to leave behind not order, but at least an inscription on a stone. The slogan for the good of Rome became an empty formality. The empire lost its sense of purpose, and without an idea, all that's left is inertia. Corruption was like the air they breathed. When everything in the system can be bought and sold, even the strongest walls collapse. In late Rome, everything was for sale. Military ranks, judicial positions, citizenship, tax breaks. Even a senator's seat could be bought for a generous sack of gold. Officials took kickbacks. Provincial governors squeezed the local population for money. The armies were underpaid, so they started looting their own people. Slaves paid for the right to work easier jobs, and prostitutes paid for the right to work near the temples. Everyone knew about it. No one was surprised, no one was outraged. It became the norm. The city where no one wanted to work, the Roman capital, once a center of culture and industry, turned into a city of consumers. Free rations, entertainment, subsidies. People forgot how to work. Legionnaires came back from war and couldn't find their place in life. Young people no longer dreamed of glory. She dreamed of a patron and entertainment. Production declined and crafts died out. Dependence on the provinces became critical. Without Egypt, there would be no bread. Without Spain, no silver. Without Africa, no oil. The empire that was supposed to feed others became a parasite itself. An army without spirit. Once, the Roman army was a symbol of discipline and honor. But by the 4th century AD, it became a breeding ground for mercenaries, traitors, and indifferent soldiers. Loyalty was bought, and when the treasury ran dry, it was sold back. Many legions were recruited from barbarians, the very same people they had recently fought against. Yes, they were strong, but Rome was foreign to them. They didn't care who they protected, as long as they got paid. And it was becoming harder and harder to pay them. Inflation was rising, coins were losing their value, and with it, the very idea of service was fading. Spiritual erosion. Morality weakened along with politics. People stopped believing not only in the gods, but in each other as well. Patriotism became a joke. Honor became an archaic concept. Family became just a formality. People weren't building a future, they were just surviving in the present. The level of education was falling, schools were closing. Rhetoric turned into meaningless speeches, and art became just a repetition of old forms. No one was creating anything new, everyone was copying, and the audience applauded without knowing why. The decline of the cities. Rome, once gleaming with marble, began to crack. The sewers clogged, columns sagged, and the forums emptied. Buildings turned into ruins. They were dismantled for stone to use in other constructions. Trade came to a halt. Poverty was on the rise. The connection between social classes was breaking apart. The rich hid away in their villas, while the poor crowded into filthy alleys. Cities lost their purpose. They became just places where people waited for the end. The scariest thing about decline is not the enemies at the gates, but people who just don't care anymore. And when most of the population starts thinking, let it all burn, it doesn't do anything for me anyway. That's exactly what happened to Rome. People didn't step up to defend it, didn't intervene, didn't fight because they didn't feel that Rome belonged to them. There was a time when Romans would say, I am a citizen of Rome, with pride. Now, they said it with indifference or didn't say it at all. The empire didn't collapse. It just stopped being needed. When Rome fell, there was no apocalypse, no earth-shattering end of the world. Everything happened almost quietly, without thunder, without an epic battle for survival. It was just that one day the doors were open, and no one bothered to close them. The barbarians at the gates were afraid of the barbarians. They called everyone barbarians, the Goths, the Vandals, the Alans, the Huns. They were depicted as wild, bloodthirsty, and alien. But by the 5th century, these so-called savages were already living inside the Roman Empire, trading, serving in the army, raising Roman children. They had become part of the very world they were supposedly threatening. When Alaric, the king of the Visigoths, approached Rome in 410, his army was not a horde of savages. These were people, many of whom had grown up within the empire. They were demanding the promised payments, land, and justice. They were refused, so they entered. The sack of Rome. Alaric did not come to burn Rome to the ground. He came to show that the empire was no longer strong. The city, which hadn't seen an enemy at its gates for 100 years, was shaken, but it did not resist. There were almost no defenders. The army did not come. The Senate was at a loss, and the people were in shock. Alaric entered like a victor stepping into the arena, without rage, without fanaticism. They looted, yes, but selectively, temples, treasuries, the homes of the wealthy. They didn't destroy the city, didn't burn it, they simply dismantled it. This wasn't an invasion. It was a demonstration. No one stood up to defend it. That was the real tragedy. The great capital of the world, the center of civilization, didn't fall. It was abandoned. No one fought for it. Not the people, not the army, not the politicians. People ran away, hid, prayed, or simply waited. Rome didn't die by an enemy's sword. It died from the indifference of its own citizens. An empire on paper. After the year 410, Rome still existed formally. There were emperors, there were decrees, there were celebrations. But all of that was just an illusion. Real power was shifting into the hands of the military. The provinces governed themselves. Money was printed without any gold backing it. No one followed the laws anymore. The empire became a phantom. In 476, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, Romulus Augustulus, was overthrown by the Germanic leader Odoacer. This event is considered the official end of the empire, but most people living at the time didn't even notice. What was left behind, Rome was gone, but it didn't disappear. Its roads guided merchants for centuries to come. Its Latin language became the foundation for half of Europe. Its laws formed the basis of the courts. Its religion became the official one. But its morals, spirit, and sense of responsibility were gone. All that remained was a trace, stone, ruins, dust. A great civilization that conquered the world vanished because it couldn't overcome itself. No enemy was more terrifying than the rot within. The result, a mirror for all empires. The story of Rome is not a warning about barbarians, but about ourselves. When you build a system on fear, one day it will turn against you. When you humiliate, rob, and oppress, one day there will be no one left to protect you. When you forget how to feel, to think, to remember, you will disappear, even if the walls remain. Rome was great, but its dark side was just as great, because it was that darkness that destroyed the empire, not the swords of outsiders. You've just watched a story that is rarely told in school. A story of sins, pain, and silence. But it's in these shadows that the real lessons are born. If you've listened all the way to the end, you'll never look at Rome the same way again. Support us with a like and a subscription. It helps us bring you more honest stories. We truly appreciate you spending your valuable time with us today. Thank you so much for joining and sharing in this exploration. We hope you enjoyed uncovering the fascinating stories and forgotten moments that history has left behind. Please stay tuned and join us again next time as we continue our journey together, discovering what remains hidden in the dust of history. Until then, take care and see you soon.